Hi, I'm Jim Moran, Vice President for Programs and Outreach at the American Antiquarian Society. Today we hear a great deal about fake news, and one might assume that this is a contemporary issue. But in fact, fake news has been with us from at least the beginning of our country. As one example, take a look at this. This is the May 3rd, 1775 issue of the Massachusetts Spy. It was created by Isaiah Thomas, the founder of the American Antiquarian Society. The original is housed in our library in Worcester, Massachusetts. But because of the COVID-19 pandemic crisis, I'm here in my home office and sharing with you this facsimile of the May 3rd issue of The Spy. This facsimile is very faithful to the original, including being the same size as the original. And it even has a copy of the notation that Thomas wrote in his own hand after printing the first issue, which is this newspaper is the first thing ever printed in Worcester, Isaiah Thomas. This newspaper is typical of most 18th century newspapers. They were sold by subscription, and most colonial newspapers had a subscription rate of 600. This newspaper, however, was created for the middle class. The style was very simple and very direct, and as a result, it was very, very popular. In fact, Thomas had a subscription rate of 3,500. Now, most 18th century newspapers, as The Spy was, were folio in size. They were 4 pages. Their type is very, very dense and close together. Very few illustrations, mostly just woodcuts. And because they're sold by subscription, the placement of the news is different. There is no top fold with the latest breaking news story in it, because it doesn't need to advertise the newspaper in that way. In fact, most of the front pages of colonial newspapers had advertisements and news from Europe and England, where the breaking news would be in the interior. And in fact, Thomas's accounts of the battles of Lexington and Concord occurs on page 3 of this issue. Thomas was present at Lexington and Concord, and that's made the great historian of journalism, Frank Luther Mott, describe him as our first American war correspondent. But Thomas was a far cry from a journalist as we think of them today. Thomas was principally a printer, and while he was looking for information to put in his newspaper, he didn't have the same sense of impartial acquiring of news that we come to think of as the hallmark of journalism today. In fact, the term journalist doesn't even enter the lexicon until the mid-19th century. And the development of impartial news gathering is something that develops over the course of the 19th and into the 20th century. Thomas does begin his account in a very dramatic way, and let me read for you that. Americans, forever bear in mind the Battle of Lexington, where British troops, unmolested and unprovoked, wantonly and in a most inhuman manner, fired upon and killed a number of our countrymen, then robbed them of their provisions, ransacked, plundered, and burnt their houses. Nor could the tears of defenseless women, some of whom were in the pains of childbirth, the cries of helpless babes, nor the prayers of old age, confined to beds of sickness, appease their thirst for blood, nor divert them from their design of murder and robbery. As you can see, Thomas is a far cry from a dispassionate voice that we come to expect from our journalists today. Even if we put the hyperbolic language aside, there are still some statements in this that fall clearly under the category of fake news. The woman in the pains of childbirth, most likely referred to Hannah Adams, who lived in Cambridge and not Lexington, but she did testify under oath to a justice of the peace that she was forcibly removed from her home by British soldiers as she was recovering from the recent birth of her sixth child. The phrase, "the cries of old age confined to beds of sickness," most likely refers to the deposition of Benjamin and Rachel Cooper, who testified that soldiers fired more than 100 bullets into their home, and while they escaped into the cellar, two aged gentlemen who lived with them were immediately, most barbarously and inhumanely murdered by the British soldiers. As ghastly as this testimony is, none of these people were sick or confined to bed. Thomas knew about these depositions because he printed them, and he makes a plug for them in the second paragraph of this account. Later on in the story, Thomas claims that two officers fired first at Lexington Town Green, and then he describes the fighting at the North Bridge when he says, "Thus did the troops of Britain's king first fire," first in all capitals, "at two several times upon his loyal American subjects, and put a period to 10 lives before one gun was fired upon them." No one knows who fired first at Lexington Town Green and created the shot heard round the world. But it was very important that we maintain our own sense of innocence. Thomas also makes no mention of why all these heavily armed militiamen were at the town green before dawn. This is something that usually doesn't happen unless, of course, you're willing to start a war. And finally, Thomas ends his account with this statement. "We have the pleasure to say that notwithstanding the highest provocation given by the enemy, not one instance of cruelty that we have heard of was committed by our militia, but listening to the merciful dictates of the Christian religion, they breathed higher sentiments of humanity." We're the ones wearing the white tricorn hats. This newspaper was published on May 3rd, which is 2 weeks from the actual fighting at Lexington and Concord. And that kind of begs the question, why was it published so late? After all, there's no one in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts who was not aware of Lexington and Concord by this date. In fact, David Hackett Fisher, in his book Paul Revere's Ride, talks about people leaving their homes in a panic, fearful the regulars are going to come back out from Boston and wreak even more violence on the countryside. There are other accounts of the battles that appear before this one. So why does Thomas choose to do this? Well, the answer lies with his subscription. He has 3,500 subscribers, and they're all over the colonies. They're settled throughout the seacoast of what is now the United States. And it was very important that we reach those people, many of whom were wondering what was going on here in Massachusetts, and were we being too hot-headed in our response to the royal authorities. It was really important that we articulate the reasons for our violence, that we articulate our own innocence in the affair, and that a call to action be laid out, which Thomas does. And he does it above his banner. Americans, liberty or death, join or die. Sometimes fake news is essential to the creation and maintenance of a nation. We have many other materials for educators about this document, about the beginnings of the American Revolution, and about American history in general. Please check our website for further details. Thanks for watching. And from all of us here at the American Antiquarian Society, keep on booking.